So tell me about your mother's parents. So that would be your grandparents on the mother's side.
On my mom's side, grandma and grandpa, I believe his name was Jacob, but I'm not positive because I don't remember much about my grandparents on my mom's side. I remember that Grandma Jansen was a very soft-spoken person. I don't know how much English she understood, but her words were just barely above a whisper. Just very soft-spoken. So I didn't know much about her. I mean, I remember being around her some, but I don't remember my grandpa at all. I believe I met him once, and only once, and I don't even remember that. But he was diagnosed with tuberculosis or the consumption, which, what else is it called nowadays?
Yeah, tuberculosis, yeah.
It's the same thing?
Yeah, I think so, isn't it? Yeah.
A lung disease.
Yeah.
But the other one was something else, I thought. But, all right. And he was put in an institution, and I don't know much about him because he died shortly thereafter. When he was released, he died of a massive heart attack. And let's see. I remember visiting vaguely the farm that they lived on, and it was around Christmas time. And what we got, the three of us older kids that were born over in Canada and before the others, I don't even know what year that was. I know we were young, but you also have to take into account that I was looking in on life rather than being part of life, because that was before the tumor was found. We were at the farmhouse, and for Christmas we got a stocking with oranges and nuts, and I'm trying to think what else. We might have gotten a doll for Claire and I, but Wesley, I can't remember what Wesley got. But I do remember being there, and they had draft horses, and one was called Queenie. And I went out to see it, but I was scared of that. I mean, it was a huge horse.
And you were little, yeah.
And I was little. And I was very much spooked by it. But when they took me to see a goat, the goat was fine. Which was very funny. But I remember that vaguely, and I remember vaguely that we stayed in the room above where the old-fashioned stove pipe would go through, so we could look on, but we couldn't hear much anyways because they made sure of that. They spoke German in amongst themselves, and they never taught us, because part of it is that they could talk about us or about what they didn't want us to know in our presence. So they never taught us German, and also the other thing was high and low German, and I don't know which set of parents or grandparents was which one. But that was vaguely one visit that I remember, and really the only one that I know of. And then there was other times that one other time I believe my parents took us to the farm, and I was with them at the time. But that came later. But and then on my dad's side, his parents were over in Ukraine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's where my dad was born.
They were Dutch, right? And
they were Dutch, but they were living...
there was a big historical thing where a bunch of the Dutch went to Ukraine because it was a huge farming area. So there was an emigration there. So that's where they ended up being there as families before the revolution.
Well, that explains
before
it.
The revolution.
Okay, that's where my dad was born. Mm-hmm. He was born on January 25th, 1925. And... I guess about a year later, that's when they went to Canada. I want to say U.S., but it was the Canadian side. Mm-hmm. And he was born the year that Lenin, or was it Stalin, came to power. I think it was Lenin.
I'll look it up. It was 1917. Russian Revolution was 1917. That was Lenin.
So it's Stalin. It was the same year, I believe, that Stalin came to power. but they had to get a visa. And number one, they were indentured. Someone over in Canada paid for their passage, and they also had to get approval, visas and stuff like that to come over. But they lived in this would you call it a commune? Sort
Maybe,
of, I think that's
yeah.
what they call it. But I remember
They were Mennonites, so they probably were in some kind
and
of
it was
farming
in
community
the-
at least.
yes,
Yeah, at the very
farming
least.
community. And I remember reading several times, and my dad mentioned it. The palm grinds is what I think it's called, where it was at the time that they were confiscating guns and rifles and so forth and so on from the citizens around.
The Civil War ended. Russian Civil War ended in 1923,
Yeah.
so that would have made sense that he was very.
And they were confiscating the rifles and stuff like that.
But he wasn't Jewish, so I'm not sure.
No, but the
program was really-
Mennonites, they were exempt
Right,
because they were just farming people.
Right.
But
But they took over the Russians. The communists took over the farms. So
Yes, and then they also lined up the man, had them dig a mass grave, which was, I'm sure, they didn't call it a mass grave at that time, by holding them up and having the women watch their husbands being shot. And I guess that's about the time my grandparents decided it was time to see if they can get out. This is all just a subject. Claire might know more information than me. I don't know. And they got someone over here in Canada to pay for their passage. And that's how they became indentured servants. They got visas. They were permitted to leave. But they didn't give one for my dad because they didn't want to lose their man because they're going to, I guess, workers and so forth. Even though my dad was only about a year old when they left. My grandma, now this is what's been told to me. I don't know all the details or anything like that. I might have even heard it wrong. I don't really know. But I understand that my grandma Thiessen was paralyzed after having my dad. And she hid him under her skirts because she couldn't walk. She was paralyzed. So they snuck him on board. And I don't know when it became obvious that she had a baby with her. I don't even know if the ship captain or whoever even cared that he was on there. But that's how they came to Canada. My grandma Thiessen spoke German, and I suppose probably some Dutch. And Grandpa Thiessen was able to wrap his mind around English more than anything. But around the house, I believe they all spoke German because my Grandma Thiessen didn't learn English very well. When we talked to her, we had to have an interpreter, so I never really got to know my Grandma Thiessen because it's not always possible to have someone around to interpret. The only thing I do remember is every time we went to visit my Grandma Thiessen, she made what they call, and it's only over in Canada that I know that they made these, and it's Mennonite ammonia cookies, and they were good at first, but my grandma overdid it by sneaking those cookies to us. We got our fill really quick, but we couldn't refuse her giving us cookies. So for my part, I know I squirreled them away somewhere and got rid of them. I don't know. But it's just something to reminisce because it was just unique. You don't get a hold of those kind of cookies very often anymore. I found out where you can buy the powder. It's sort of like a baking powder, the ammonia thing. Yeah. But that was one of the things that I remember. And
now your dad's father, he was remember that?
a person that, like I said, he was a farmer. He helped, and of course, Grandma and his kids. There was only 3. Like I said, there was my dad, my Uncle Peter, and then Louise. And I don't know, and I know my dad was the oldest brother, but I'm not sure. But it could be Louise, my father, and then Peter. Peter was supposed to have been a twin, but his twin died, was stillborn. So they only had the three. Grandma might have had a whole lot more kids, but in those days you never know, because apparently there is a gene in our family that has cystic fibrosis, and if they couldn't diagnose, which they probably couldn't at that time, a lot of babies died.
Now, your grandfather, your dad's dad, from secondhand, of course, but he was pretty strict. I mean,
He was very strict, yes. My dad, if he did something wrong, there was a lot of accountability. And then nowadays it would have been called child abuse. But during those days, no.
just got a whooping for whatever.
Really whooping.
Yeah.
The expression my dad would use is he beat me to the inch of my life.
Right.
So they all worked on the farm, and I guess my dad, and this is a Mennonite community over in Canada, and my dad decided to leave, and he got a job as a truck driver. I don't know if he owned the truck or someone's supplied the truck or whatever. I don't even know what he transported.
Is it? I mean, your grandfather, after he paid off his debts for the indentured servitude, he became fairly wealthy, though.
Yeah.
But investing, he was sort of cheap, right? Basically,
He was frugal,
it was money.
is what they
He might
call
have
it.
given. He might have invested in your father's truck, maybe. I'm guessing.
I
don't
have
know, though.
no idea.
Yeah.
That part's
That could be.
that part is.
But anyway, your dad
Became
started
a truck
trucking.
driver, yes.
Right.
And that's when he lost an index, the tip of his index finger. It's always been a step, because us kids were always fascinated by that one finger of my father's, because it didn't have a normal nail. It had a hook. It was cut off. The tip was cut off,
Right,
and
right.
there was a nail growing from it, but it was not like this. And I guess we were all fascinated by it. But apparently what happened was the truck door got slammed. His finger, it was slammed on his finger somehow. Don't know how or whatever, but he lost it. They couldn't even reattach.
Yeah.
And
So that's what you think somehow, as his trucking career is, what you have told me before, is that somehow he met your mother.
I think it's because he traveled,
Maybe.
because he was
She
in
was in-
Saskatoon,
Right.
Saskatchewan, and my mom was over on the West Coast, which was along the lines of Calgary and so forth. Calgary. So in between, somewhere he met. I don't know where my mom was an indentured, or not. She was not an indentured. She was hired out as a housemaid to a woman. I don't know whether she was the cook or the maid or what she did. But somehow they met. So
It's one of those things you don't know. Now,
Yeah.
Claire might know. We'll have to ask her someday. But
Claire might know. I personally don't know.